I could play the criminal aspects of my life down some, but then it wouldn't be me. That was the pertinent part, the thing at school and home I was constantly rejecting in process. All my life I pretended with my folks, it was the thing in the street that was real. I was certainly just pretending with the nuns and priests. I served mass so that I could be in a position to steal altar wine, sang in the choir because they made me. When we went on tour of the rich white Catholic schools we were always treated very well, fed, rewarded with gifts. Old Father Brown hated me but always put me down front when we were on display. I can't say exactly why, I was the ugliest, skinniest little misfit in the group. Black men born in the U.S. and fortunate enough to live past the age of 18 are conditioned to accept the inevitability of prison. For most of us, it simply looms as the next phase in a sequence of humiliations. Being born a slave in a captive society and never experiencing any objective basis for expectation had the effect of preparing me for the progressively traumatic misfortunes that lead so many black men to the prison gate. I was prepared for prison. It required only minor psychic adjustments. It always starts with Mama, mine loved me. As testimony of her love, and her fear for the fate of the man-child all slave mothers hold, she attempted to press, hide, push, capture me in the womb. The conflicts and contradictions that will follow me to the tomb started right there in the womb. The feeling of being captured, this slave can never adjust to it, it's a thing that I just don't favor, then, now, never. I've been asked to explain myself, briefly, before the world has done with me. It is difficult because I don't recognize uniqueness, not as it's applied to individualism, because it is too tightly tied into decadent capitalist culture. Rather I've always strained to see the indivisible thing cutting across the artificial barricades which have been erected to an older section of our brains, back to the mind of the primitive commune that exists in all blacks. But then how can I explain the runaway slave in terms that do not imply uniqueness? I was captured and brought to prison when I was 18 years old because I couldn't adjust. The record that the state has compiled on my activities reads like the record of 10 men. It labels me brigand, thief, burglar, gambler, hobo, drug addict, gunman, escape artist, communist revolutionary, and murderer. I was born as the Great Depression was ending. It was ending because the Second Great War for colonial markets was beginning in the U.S. I pushed out of the womb against my mother's strength September 23, 1941, I felt free. My mother was a country girl from Harrisburg, Illinois. My father was born in East St. Louis, Illinois. They met in Chicago, and were living on Lake Street near Racine when I was born. It was in one of the oldest sections of Chicago, part ghetto residential, part factory. The L train passed a few yards from our front windows, the only windows really. There were factories across the street and garage shops on the bottom level of our flat. I felt right in the middle of things. Our first move up the social scale was around the corner to 211 North Racine Street, away from the L train. I remember every detail of preschool days. I have a sister 15 months older than myself, Delora, a beautiful child and now a beautiful woman. We were sometimes allowed to venture out into the world, which at the time meant no further than fenced-off roof area adjoining our little 3-room apartment built over a tavern. We were allowed out there only after the city made its irregular garbage pickups. The roof area was behind the tavern and over an area where Propel deposited their garbage. But, of course, I went out when I pleased. Superman was several years old about then. I didn't really confuse myself with him, but I did develop a deep suspicion that I might be supra nigger, 23 years ahead of my time. I tied a tablecloth around my neck, climbed the roof's fence, and against my sister's tears would have leapt to my death, down among the garbage barrels, had she not grabbed me, tablecloth and all, and kicked my little ass. Seeing the white boys up close in kindergarten was a traumatic event. I must have seen some before in magazines or books but never in the flesh. I approached one, felt his heart, scratched at his cheek, he hit me in the head with a baseball bat. They found me crumpled in a heap just outside the schoolyard fence. After that, my mother sent me to St. Malachi Catholic Mission School. It was sitting right in the heart of the ghetto area, Washington and Oakley Streets. All of the nuns were white, of the priests, there were 5 in the parish, I think one was near black, or near white, whichever you prefer. The school ran from kindergarten to 12th grade. I attended for 9 years, 10 counting kindergarten. This small group of missionaries with their silly costumes and barbaric rituals offered the full range of Western propaganda to all ages and all comers. Sex was never mentioned except with whispers or grimaces to convey something nasty. You could get away with anything, they were anxious to make saints, but getting caught with your hand up a dress. Holy ghosts, confessions, and racism. St. Malachi's was really 2 schools. There was another school across the street that was more private than ours. We played and fought on the corner sidewalks bordering the school. They had a large grass and tree-studded garden with an 8-foot wrought iron fence bordering it, to keep us out, since it never seemed to keep any of them in when they chose to leave. They were all white. They were driven to and from school in large private buses or their parents' cars. We on the black side walked, or when we could afford it used the public buses or streetcars. The white students' yard was equipped with picnic tables for spring lunches, swings, slides, and other more sophisticated gadgets intended to please older children. For years we had only the very crowded sidewalks and alley behind the school. Years later a small gym was built, but it just stood there, locked. It was only allowed to be used for an occasional basketball game between our school and one of the others like it from across the city's various ghetto areas. Delora and I took the Lake Street streetcar to school each morning, and also on Sundays when we were forced to attend a religious function. I must have fallen from that thing 100 times while it was in motion. Each time Delora would hang on to me, trying to save me, but I was just too determined and we would roll down Lake Street, books and all, miraculously avoiding the passing cars. The other black children who went to public school laughed at us. The girls had to wear uniform, the boys wore white shirts. I imagined that the nuns and priests were laughing too every time they told one of those fantastic lies. I know now that the most damaging thing a people in a colonial situation can do is to allow their children to attend any educational facility organized by the dominant enemy culture. Before the winter of my first grade year, my father, Lester, prepared a 50-gallon steel drum to store oil for our little stove. As I watched, he cleaned the inside with gasoline. When he retreated from his work temporarily for a cigarette, he explained to me about the danger of the gas fumes. Later, when he had completed work on the barrel, I sneaked back out to the roof with my sister Delora trailing me like a Saint Bernard. I had matches and the idea of an explosion was irresistible. As soon as my sister realized what I was going to do, she turned her big sad eyes on me and started crying. I lit a match as I moved closer and closer to the barrel. The eye lit the whole book of matches. By now Delora was convinced that death was imminent for us both. She made a last brave effort to stop me, but I was too determined. I threw the matches across the last few feet. Delora shielded my eyes with her hand as the explosion went off. She still carries her burns from that day's experiences. I was injured around the lower face but carry no sign of it. Our clothes were burned and ripped away. I would probably be blind if not for this sister. My parents had 2 more children while we were hanging on there at North Racine, Francis, and Penelope. 6 of us in the little walk-up. The only thing that I can think of that was even slightly pleasant about the place was the light. We had plenty of windows and nothing higher about us to block off the sun. In '49 we moved to a place in the rear on Warren near Western that was the end of the sun. We had no windows that opened directly on the street, even the one that faced the alley was blocked by a garage. It was a larger place, but the neighborhood around the place was so vicious that my mother never allowed me to go out of the house or the small yard except to get something from one of the supermarkets or stores on Madison and return immediately. When I wanted to leave I would either go by a window, or throw my coat out the window and volunteer to take out the garbage. There was only one door. It was in the kitchen and always well guarded. I spent most of the summers of those school years in southern Illinois with my grandmother and aunt, Irene and Juanita. My mother, Georgia, called it removing me from harm's way. This was where my mother grew up and she trusted her sister Juanita, whose care I came under, completely. I was the only man-child and I was the only one to get special protection from my mother. The trips to the country were good for me in spite of the motive. I learned how to shoot rifles, shotguns, pistols. I learned about fishing. I learned to identify some of the food plants that grow wild in most areas of the U.S. I could leave the house, the yard, the town, without having to sneak out of a window. Almost everyone in the black sector of Harrisburg is a relative of mine. A loyal, righteous people, I could raise a small army from their numbers. I had use of any type of rifle or pistol on those trips downstate and everyone owned a weapon. My disposition toward guns and explosions is responsible for my first theft. Poverty made ammunition scarce and so, I confess with some guilt that I liked to shoot small animals, birds, rabbits, squirrels, anything that offered itself as a target. I was a little skinny guy, scourge of the woods, predatory man. After the summer I went back up north for school and snowball, sometimes ice block, fights with the white kids across the street. I don't remember exactly when I met Joe Adams, it was during the early years, but I do recall the circumstances. 3 or 4 of the brothers were in the process of taking my lunch when Joe joined them. The bag was torn, and the contents spilled onto the sidewalk. Joe scrambled for the food and got all of it. But after the others left laughing, he returned and stuffed it all into my pockets. We were great friends from then on at that childish way. He was older by a couple of years, 2 or 3 years means a lot at that tender age, and could beat me doing everything. I watched him and listened with John and Kenny Fox, Jr., Sonny, and others sometimes. We almost put the block's businessmen into bankruptcy. My mother and father will never admit it now, I'm sure, but I was hungry and so were we all. Our activities went from stolen food to other things I wanted, gloves for my hands, which were always cold, which I was always wearing out, marbles for the slingshots, games and gadgets for outdoorsmen from the dime store. Downtown, we plundered at will. The city was helpless to defend against us. But I couldn't keep up with Joe. Jonathan, my older brother, was born about this time. My grandfather, George Papa Davis, stands out of those early years more than any other figure in my total environment. He was separated from his wife by the system. Work for men was impossible to find in Harrisburg. He was living and working in Chicago, sending his wage back to the people downstate. He was an extremely aggressive man, and since aggression on the part of the slave means crime, he was in jail now and then. I loved him. He tried to direct my great energy into the proper form of protest. He invented long simple allegories that always pictured the white politicians as animals, jackasses, toads, goats, vermin in general. He scorned the police with special enmity. He and my mother went to great pains to impress on me that it was the worst form of niggerism to hook and jab, cut and stab at other blacks. Papa took me to his little place on lake and fed me, walked me through the wildest of the nation's jungles, pointing up the foibles of black response to crisis existence. I loved him. He died alone in southern Illinois the 5th year that I was in San Quentin, on a pension that after rent allowed for a diet of little more than sardines and crackers. After Racine Street we moved into the Troop Street projects, which in 1958 were the scenes of the city's worst riots. The cats in those projects fell out against the pig with heavy machine guns, 30s and 50s that were equipped with tracer ammunition. My troubles began when we were in the projects. I was caught once or twice for mugging, but the pig never went much further than to pop me behind the ear with the oak stick several times and send for my mortified father to carry me home. My family knew very little of my real life. In effect, I lived 2 lives, the one with my mama and sisters, and the thing on the street. Now and then I'd get caught at something, or with something that I wasn't supposed to have, and my mama would fall all over me. I left home 1,000 times, never to return. We hoboed up and down the state. I did what I wanted. All my life I've done just that. When it came time to explain, I lied. I had a girl from Arkansas, finest at the mission, but the nuns had convinced her that love, touching fingertips, mouths, bellies, legs, was nasty. Most of my time and money went to the other very loose and lovely girls I met on the stairwells of the project's 15-story buildings. That was our hangout, and most of the time that's where we acted out the ritual. Jonathan, my new comrade, just a baby then, was the only real reason that I would come home at all, a brother to help me plunder the white world, a father to be proud of the deed. I was a fanciful little cat. But my brother was too young, of course. He's only 17 now while I'm 29 this year. My father, he was always mortified. I stopped attending school regularly, and started getting picked up by the pigs more often. The pig station, a lecture, and oak stick therapeutics. These pickups were mainly for suspicion of or because I was in the wrong part of town. Except for once or twice I was never actually caught breaking any laws. There just wasn't any possibility of a policeman beating me in a foot race. A target that's really moving with evasive tactics is almost impossible to hit with a short-barreled revolver. Through a gangway with a gate that only a few can operate with speed, it's dark even in the day, up a stairway through a door. Across roofs with 7 to 10 foot jumps in between, the pig is working mainly for money. Bear in mind, I am running for my life. There wasn't a pig in the city who could follow the leader of even the most timid ghetto gang. My father sensed a need to remove me from the Chicago environment, so in 1956 he transferred his post office job to the Los Angeles area. He bought an old 49 Hudson, threw me into it, and the 2 of us came west with plans to send for the rest of the family later that year. I knew nothing of cars. It was the first car our family had ever owned. I watched my father with great interest as he pushed the Hudson across the 2,000 miles from Chicago to Los Angeles in 2 days. I was certain that I could handle the standard gear shift and pedals. I asked him to let me try upon our arrival in Los Angeles that first day. He dismissed me with a crazy nigger lay dead look. We were to stay with his cousin Johnny Jones in Watts until the rest of the family could be sent for. He went off with Johnny to visit other relatives. I stayed behind with the keys in the car. I made one corner, down one street, waited for a traffic light, firmed my jaw, dry swallowed, took off around the next corner, and ended the turn inside the plate glass window and front door of the neighborhood barber shop. Those cats in the shop, Watts, had become so immune to excitement that no one hardly looked up. I tried to apologize. The brother that owned the shop allowed my father to do the repair work himself. No pigs were called to settle this affair between brothers. One showed up by chance, however. I had to answer a court summons later that year. But the brother sensed that my father was poor, like himself, with a terribly mindless, displaced, irresponsible child on his hands, probably like his own, and didn't insist upon having the gunslinging pig from the outside enemy culture arbitrate the problems we must handle ourselves. My father fixed the brother's shop with his own hands, after buying the materials. No charges were brought against me for the damages. My father straightened out the motor bed, plugged the holes in the radiator, hammered out some of the dents and folds from the fender, bought a new light, and taped it into place on the fender. He drove the car to and from work, to the supermarkets with my mother, to church with my sisters, for 4 years. It was all he could afford and he wasn't the least bit ashamed of the fact. And he never said a word to me about it. I guess he was convinced by then that words wouldn't help me. I've been a fool, often. Serious things started to happen after our settling in LA, but this guy never abandoned me. He felt shame in having to bail me out of encounters with the law, but he would always be there. I did several months in Paso Robles for allegedly breaking into a large department store, Gold's on Central, and attempting a hijack. I was 15, and full grown. I haven't grown an inch since then. A cop shot me 6 times point blank on that job, as I was standing with my hands in the air. After the second shot, when I was certain that he was trying to murder me, I charged him. His gun was empty and he had only hit me twice by the time I had closed with him. Oh, get this wild nigger off me. My mother fell away from the phone in a dead faint when they informed her that I had been shot by the police in a hijack attempt. I had 2 comrades with me on that job. They both got away because of the exchange between the pigs and me. Since all black are thought of as rats, the 3rd degree started before I was taken to the hospital. Medical treatment was offered as a reward for cooperation. At first they didn't know I had been hit, but as soon as they saw the blood running from my sleeve, the questions began. A bullet had passed through my forearm, another had sliced my leg. I sat in the back of the pig car and bled for 2 hours before they were convinced that lockjaw must have set in already. They took me to that little clinic at the Maxwell Street station. A black nurse or doctor attended. She was young, full of sympathy and advice. She suggested, since I had strong-looking legs, that instead of warring with the enemy culture I should get interested in football or sports. I told her that if she could manage to turn the pig in the hall for a second I could escape and perhaps make a new start somewhere with the football. A month before this thing happened, a guy had sold me a motorcycle and provided a pink slip that proved to be forged or changed around in some way. The bike was hot and I was caught with it. Taken together, these 2 things were enough to send me to what California calls Youth Authority Corrections. I went to Paso Robles. The very first time, it was like dying. Just to exist at all in the cage calls for some heavy psychic readjustments. Being captured was the first of my fears. It may have been inborn. It may have been an acquired characteristic built up over the centuries of black bondage. It is the thing I've been running from all my life. When it caught up to me in 1957, I was 15 years old and not very well equipped to deal with sudden changes. The Youth Authority joints are places that demand complete capitulation. One must cease to resist altogether, or else, the employees are the same general types found lounging at all prison facilities. They need a job, any job. The state needs goons. Chino was almost new at the time. The regular housing units were arranged so that at all times one could see the lockup unit. I'd think they called it X. We existed from day to day to avoid it. How much we ate was strictly controlled, so was the amount of rest. After lights went out, no one could move from his bed without a flash of the pig's handlight. During the day the bed couldn't be touched. There were so many compulsories that very few of us could manage to stay out of trouble even with our best efforts. Everything was programmed right down to the precise spoonful. We were made to march in military fashion everywhere we went, to the gym, to the mess hall, to compulsory prayer meetings. And then we just marched. I pretended that I couldn't hear or well or understand anything but the simplest directions, so I was never given anything but the simplest work. I was lucky. Always when my mind failed me, I've had great luck to carry me through. All my life I've done exactly what I wanted to do just when I wanted, no more, perhaps less sometimes, but never any more, which explains why I had to be jailed. Man was born free. But everywhere he is in chains. I never adjusted. I haven't adjusted even yet, with half my life already spent in prison. I can't truthfully say prison is any less painful now than during that first experience. In my early prison years I read all of Raphael Sabatini, particularly The Lion's Skin. There once was a man who sold the lion's skin, while the beast still lived, and was killed while hunting him. This story fascinated me. It made me smile even under the lash. The hunter bested, the hunted stalking the hunter. The most predatory animal on earth turning on its oppressor and killing it. At the time, this ideal existed in me just above the conscious level. It helped me to define myself, but it would take me several more years to isolate my real enemy. I read Jack London's Raw and Naked, Wild and Free military novels and dreamed of smashing my enemies entirely, overwhelming, vanquishing, crushing them completely, sinking my fangs into the hunter's neck and never letting go. Capture, imprisonment, is the closest to being dead that one is likely to experience in this life. There were no beatings, for me at least, in this youth joint, and the food wasn't too bad. I came through it. When told to do something I simply played the idiot, and spent my time reading. The absent-minded bookworm. I was in full revolt by the time 7 months were up. I went to school in Paso Robles and covered the work required for 10th-year students in the California school system, and entered manual arts for the 11th year upon my release. After I got out I stopped in Bakersfield, where I planned to stay no more than a week or two. I met a woman who felt almost as unimpressed with life as I did. We sinned, I stayed. I was 16 then, just starting to get my heft, but this wonderful sister, so round and wild, firm and supple, mature, in 1 month she reduced my health so that I had to take to the bed permanently. I was ill for 11 days with fevers and chest pains, something in the lungs. When I pulled out of it I was broke. I'd collected a few friends by that time. 2 of them would try anything. Matt and Abe. We talked, borrowed a car, and went off. A few days later we were all 3 in county jail, Kern County, on suspicion of committing a number of robberies. Since the opposition cleans up the books when they find the right type of victim, they accused us of a number of robberies we knew nothing about. Since they had already identified me for one, I copped out to another and cleared Matt and Abe on that count. They allowed Abe to plead guilty to 1 robbery instead of the 3 others they threatened him with. They cleared Matt altogether. 2 months after our arrest Matt left the county jail free of charges. I was in the time tank instead of the felony tank because they had only 2 felony tanks, that was the old county jail, and they wanted to keep the 3 of us separated. After Matt left, a brother came into the time tank to serve 2 days. The morning he was scheduled to leave I went back to his cell with a couple of sheets and asked him if he would aid me in an escape attempt. He dismissed me with one of those looks and a wave of the hand. I started tearing the sheet in stripes, he watched. When I was finished he asked me, "What are you doing with that sheet?" I replied, "I'm tearing it into these strips." "Why you doing that?" "I'm making a rope." "What you gonna do with our rope?" "Oh, I'm going to tie you up with it." When they called him to be released that morning, I went out in his place. I've learned one very significant thing for our struggle here in the U.S., all blacks do look alike to certain types of white people. White people tend to grossly underestimate all blacks, out of habit. Blacks have been overestimating whites in a conditioned reflex. Later, when I was accused of robbing a gas station of $70, I accepted a deal. I agreed to confess and spare the county court costs in return for a light county jail sentence. I confessed, but when time came for sentencing, they tossed me into the penitentiary with 1 to life. That was in 1960. I was 18 years old. I've been here ever since. I met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao when I entered prison and they redeemed me. For the first 4 years I studied nothing but economics and military ideas. I met black guerrillas, George Big Jake Lewis, and James Carr, W.L. Nolan, Bill Christmas, Torrey Gibson and many others. We attempted to transform the black criminal mentality into a black revolutionary mentality. As a result, each of us has been subjected to years of the most vicious reactionary violence by the state. Our mortality rate is almost what you would expect to find in a history of Dachau. 3 of us were murdered several months ago by a pig shooting from 30 feet above their heads with a military rifle. I am being tried in court right now with 2 other brothers, John Clutchett and Fleta Drumgo, for the alleged slaying of a prison guard. This charge carries an automatic death penalty for me. I can't get life. I already have it. When I returned to San Quentin prison last week from a year in Soledad prison where the crime I am charged with took place, a brother who had resisted the logic of proletarian people's revolutionary socialism for the black men in America sent me these lines in a note: "Without the cold and desolation of winter there could not be the warmth and splendor of spring. Calamity has hardened my mind, and turned it to steel. Power to the people. George."